I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to this larger team, probably highlighting mostly our guests for today. I was curious, Cecilia, French, Jay, were there any key takeaways that you heard today consistently that you felt like you wanted to highlight from today's conversation? And
No,
if not,
I guess the number one.
Yeah.
Oh, Cecilia, go ahead, please.
I would just say that as you can see, they're very common. And so back to our original point about there should be no embarrassment, no shame. There are best practices now that are available. You are part of a community now. You know, many businesses, almost all businesses, are looking at the cloud. And you know, just to reinforce, there's plenty of resources available to you. Best practices have been developed. There's plenty of community among technical leaders, but also amongst cloud companies, and trying to address, you know, make this easier for businesses. So I think there should be only the recognition that you're not alone, plenty of options in terms of resourcing to get help.
that's a great one. Thank you, Cecilia. Jay, it sounded like you were going to chime in.
Well, you know, actually, I'm going to just follow on Cecilia's point for a quick second. And the one thing, I guess, you know, she mentioned that you're not alone. And then part of the comfort throughout this process is working with a partner who's had a chance to see just a high volume of different challenges and different scenarios, different use cases, different industries, verticals. So when you go through that, you're getting a collective experience that's well beyond what you could find by hiring, you know, any one individual. So I guess that's the point, is there are best practices that exist, and save yourself the time and hassle of trying to learn those lessons internally. You know, leverage a managed service offering really does help you get down to driving value and shortening that time to value. That's the key point, I guess.
Thank you, Jay, for that. I really appreciate it. How about from the InterVision team? Were there any kind of common themes that we heard throughout the day that you felt like you wanted to highlight?
Well, I'll say, you know, as I was listening to both French and Cecilia, I swear it's like I've worked for both of your companies, you know, and so yeah, the themes are absolutely in line. I would say that, you know, that learning from your fellow compadres in the industry is a great way to avoid some of the pitfalls that others have made, and I would encourage, you know, more of these kinds of discussions to take place. There's a lot of great information. We sponsor a lot of these. I encourage folks to listen to the podcasts. You know, Cecilia, yours was great. And again, I thought it felt a lot like I was listening to organizations I've worked in the past. So those are great sources of opportunity to learn.
Yeah, I'd jump in there real quick just to say, you know, I'd mentioned, you know, our partnership with InterVision in regards to the disaster recovery. And, you know, you look at some of the poll results, you know, the lack of cloud skills and security concerns being people's biggest barriers to adopting cloud. And I really believe that, you know, a partnership with somebody like InterVision can help overcome some of those barriers. And I think InterVision's done a great job today outlining some of their capabilities and some of the programs that they're offering people in order to kind of tackle those concerns today. So I would encourage people to take advantage of those.
Chris, you're muted.
Hey, it wouldn't be a 3-hour discussion without at least a couple of those. So how about the InterVision team? Anything jump out from you, John or Dustin or Jamie, in this conversation that you felt like you wanted to highlight? And if not, I'd actually want to have another question here posed to the team. There was a couple of questions that came in that were relevant to choosing a cloud provider, right? We've got the big three out there: GCP, Azure, AWS. French, there was actually a question for you specifically. What were some of your decision criteria as you thought about your various options and who to use where in terms of the cloud provider?
Part of it was for us. We've been a Google Workspace customer for over a decade. So we have a long and very good relationship with Google. So that really kind of led us to, and again, it was, somebody had made the point, there's a lot of pieces to cloud, and we really started leveraging some of their kind of data warehousing and analytics capabilities pretty early, which then led us to more of infrastructure as a service. So we were just kind of on that path with them for about a decade now. So it was kind of a natural progression there. But you know, as great as our relationship is with Google, we then had a choice. It's like, well, if that relationship sours, we want to make sure that we've got the flexibility to pivot. And then to your point, it came down to the two other players, AWS and Microsoft. And nothing against Microsoft, but we just felt AWS, you know, just they'd been in the business longer. They're more cloud native. You know, Microsoft has a lot of legacy stuff that they still have to deal with. And plus with InterVision, with your experience, it was just, again, it was more of a natural progression toward AWS as our backup provider.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. So, and that was a question that came in from the audience. I wanted to make sure I had addressed. So another question I had for the collective team, and John, I think maybe I'll highlight you specifically first here, because you had a great example you brought up last time we talked about this. But what are some real world examples, and I mean the specific business results you've seen from a successful cloud adoption, right? We talk a lot about the technology side, but when this is done right, what are some of the results you've seen out there in the market when folks are really nailing their cloud adoption?
Was that for John Gray?
Yeah, we'll give him a moment. If not, feel free for
Chris, I could take that question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the things I think we're seeing is back, you know, if you look over to like the last few decades, so we'll go back to like the 60s, and you look at the average tenure in the Fortune 500 back then, it was roughly like 30 to 40 years. I think 33 is about right. And now it's decreased down to about 12. So what you're seeing is, as modernization happens, as new technology emerges, the need to constantly change has gone from a long process where you could have a core competency that you could ride for several years or decades potentially, to the need to change on a much more frequent basis. And the overall challenge becomes, how do you change at pace? How do you keep the pace of innovation going inside your organization? So when you look to customers that are looking to solve big problems, what they're really saying is, a lot of times, is how do I listen to my customer and evolve to meet changing needs from the customer or from the market as a whole? So when you look at it, for us, we say, okay, can we help you drive that innovation process? Can we give you the skills, the tools, and the capabilities, and an environment that's managed and secure and compliant that allows you to drive that innovation? So when you see that, kind of the thing that we look at is, how frequently can you make changes to your infrastructure? How quickly are you developing applications? You know, if you're on-prem, can you migrate quickly to the cloud? So when you think about things like a cloud migration duration, when you from start to finish, how long does that process take? And as you know, you could stall. You can take years, or you can condense that down to weeks, right? So I think that's one thing. So then, as you roll out those new applications, there's a question here about, you know, what kind of business value are you creating? So when you see that innovation, what kind of revenue and return are you seeing on your investment in those core capabilities? I think is a good one. And then overall, as we talked about with cost optimization, you know, for us, it's a absolutely huge thing. If you don't configure and right size instances and use things, you know, like we have a lot of different capabilities we can bring to the table to help you optimize cost. But, you know, on-prem is different from in the cloud. And the key benefit of the cloud is not just innovation, but it's impacting operations and driving cost savings. So I'd say all those things. So if you can see those, you know, 30% reductions that you guys guarantee, if you're seeing a increasing pace of innovation and leveraging things like machine learning and artificial intelligence to use the data that you have in-house today to develop solutions that resonate with your audience and your customer base, I think that's the thing we're kind of using to measure overall success.
Yeah, I would echo that. And I would also say, success breeds further success. And
Exactly.
if you think back to, I mean, you were using your analogy of timeline there is, 20 years ago, over 70% of the technical job titles that we have today didn't even exist, right? So like nobody, there was no such thing as a site reliability engineer up until just very recently. And so, what drives that is, kind of the continuous innovation and delivery. And when we talk about the cloud consumption model shifting from a traditional on-premise hardware model to one of software, now you've taken everybody and you've turned them into these types of engineers. They can start measuring something very specifically, which is velocity. How long does it take for me to go from ideation to implementation? Or in other words, how quickly can my code go from an idea to into production? And that is something that is very motivating for engineers. And so I think that's another way you can start to see is as they start to measure those key performance indicators and they publish them and make them more visible, the success becomes contagious.
I love that,
Chris,
Dustin.
Yeah, I would
just hit on
I
a
would agree.
couple. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm working product development, so we know we're successful when the engineers come to a product development roadmap meeting telling the product development team, we can go faster, we can be cheaper, we are using the cloud, and we will show you. And now it becomes a bi-directional conversation about the business roadmap.
That's awesome. And Cecilia, you probably start as a result, you probably start seeing more of the product people coming to the demos as your development team is doing them. So it's symbiosis,
Yep.
and everybody wants to be part of that shared success, which is awesome.
And the one thing I'll comment,
Yes,
Dustin, as
agreed.
well is one of the things that we see commonly is when we come in with a managed service solution, it frees up engineers that used to maybe they were working on infrastructure before, and now they're doing DevOps, or now they're doing containerization. They're doing things that are exciting. It motivates them, retention rates increase, and they feel like they're directly contributing to the overall success of the organization and driving that, as opposed to the guy in the basement. So it's a
Yeah.
different thing.
Mhm.
It really gets buy-in. And so I think if you want to build that culture, you need to do those things that get your employees to buy in, and by all means giving people the tools and the ability to leverage the newest things in the market to really have a demonstrable impact is it definitely goes hands down. That we've seen a lot of that.
Jamie, I wanted to make sure you got to chime in. Thanks so much for that, Jay. It sounded like you were going to pop in with a couple of examples. I know you're very close to a lot of the work we do. I'm just curious if you wanted to share some
Yeah.
business examples.
Yeah, no problem. I think French hit a couple. So when he ran through some of those business drivers, I see those very similar. We've got several customers where business units were using a DRaaS cloud solution. Others were not. They got hit with ransomware. The ones that had an ability to quickly back up and test it, make sure it worked, were up and running. The departments that had not rolled it out were struggling. I mentioned earlier in the talk about rolling out a Amazon AWS Connect. So being able to pull up a contact center that maybe you didn't have before. So if you look at LAUSD, they put one up over a weekend to take the flood of calls that were happening in COVID, so that people could, that all of a sudden they weren't prepared for a flood of 750,000 students and their parents making phone calls. So whether you're a business like a school district where that happens, or you're sitting in your own enterprise, the contact centers are oftentimes not just for external, they can be internal too, so that you have a programmable way now to route people as they're much more remote. The one that I mentioned earlier that I think stands out to me is just the best one. In fact, I've shared it with people outside of the industry just because I think it is it's such a cool story around Taskus, right? So Taskus, having all their they do back-end support for very large companies that you would all know, and they sit in the Philippines with their call centers. That's where a lot of their competition does. The competition is running on kind of more legacy infrastructure, so they were tethered to their desk. The pandemic hits, and they can't send people home, so they have to stay there in the contact center. Taskus was able to send immediately everybody home and say, don't worry, we will figure out And they figured it out through workspaces, the ability to make sure that whether it's through their iPad or home PC, that they were doing the same work they could do within that office. So they already had, as I mentioned, the highest rating in their business. Can you imagine the rating now they have? Because they were cloud first, their first thought process was, when this unbeknownst challenge came, nobody ever expected that to happen, they had the agility to absolutely respond so quickly. They didn't know necessarily how, but they knew it was going to be a cloud solution. And they were able to then get everybody up and running, continue that process. People were able to work from home, do their, quarantining and that process. So, one kid's chicken or egg, one could argue, were they people first and then they went cloud first? Or because they were cloud first, they went people first? Think about that. And that is something that I think, if you talk about a business impact, where would you want to work if that was your line of business or your field of work? At the company that had that agility and that capability, or somebody that said, sorry, I realize we're in a tough situation, but we don't have any other options. You're tethered to your desk. So, Chris, I quickly talked through that one before, but man, if you can't, and we helped them through that process. We got, I think at the time it was 10 to 12,000 people working with their time, and the quote was, you guys got it delivered in under the time recorded, and it was like in a week. And that was also extending all their security parameters out into the cloud to make sure that when everybody was moving from inside to out, were fully capable of still, experiencing that security concern that is top of mind and was obviously one of the top of the poll questions. So I can't think of a better example than cloud first or people first. Either way, that's a really good story about agility.
Yeah, and we saw so much of that with COVID, right? The folks that were further along in their cloud adoption journey were able to make that pivot a lot faster. And so, yeah, I mean, it just goes to show, that technology can have such a huge impact on the people side of the business as well. Any other stories out there from the team on just success we've seen in the business realm on the cloud?
I can just say personally, kind of jumping on what Jamie was just talking about, COVID for us was basically a non-event because we were so far along. Like I said, we had been a Google Workspace customer for over 10 years. We use virtual desktops, much like Amazon's workspaces. And about 2 weeks after sending everyone home, we just sent out a survey asking people, hey, how are you doing? Do you feel productive? What are your barriers? And the number one response basically was, I feel more productive because I'm getting interrupted less than when I'm at work. So for us, for an IT group, we took that feedback as a pretty resounding success that we had been designing. I guess our approach was, we realized about 10 years ago that people expected to be productive wherever they were at, whether they were at home, on an iPad, on a plane, in a restaurant. So we purposely started designing our services around that expectation. And the cloud was just a really great way for us to deliver that experience to them.
One other thing that kind of comes to mind for me too, Chris, is when the pandemic started, I was working with a client and they were doing online delivery, and we'd help them set up basically the entire platform as a code base, and they were doing online delivery of technical training. And the way it was set up before was basically, after they got to the 9th class, before the 10th class got provisioned, it would spin up new workloads inside of AWS to help handle the ephemerability of these workloads. Well, when COVID hit, they found that their class size average went from 10 people per class down to 2 people per class on average. Well, so you only had 2 paying customers per class, but because the algorithm was written on the number of total classes and not on the total number of students, you don't need a slide rule to figure out that that's a going out of business plan. You don't have enough money coming in and too much money going out. But because we did everything as a code base, we were able to help them really quickly regenerate that algorithm and provision those workloads based on what made the most sense relative to a consumption model. And so that's just kind of highlights one of the flexibilities that the cloud gives you. Yeah. So was it a specific failure, yes, but it was an absolute success because they were able to respond and have resilience inside of the cloud in order to meet the demands and still have a financial model that made sense.
That's awesome. Thanks, Dustin. Any other stories before maybe we move on to another question?
Yeah, I would just add one last thing that we're seeing a big uptick in, and we have some real domain expertise around it in the semiconductor EDA space. And many of those clients have been, just due to legacy processes, have been slower to adopt the cloud. And so as they've looked at that process, they're really going, hey, we have to market or budget out extremely high, thresholds as we do our chip design, because we don't quite know what we're going to need in our compute and storage. So the extension of what they have to buy versus what they have to use, and who hasn't had this provisioning challenge, has always been a big challenge for them. And so as they've looked to move into the cloud, at a slower pace than most, but rapidly starting to accelerate into the adoption of it. We had one client tell us that he probably saved around, a third of his budget. I think it was like $600,000-$700,000. And his joke was, "I'm the CFO's new best friend," because he could go in and be much more predictable on what exactly he needed. And if he needed to go beyond that, he could just scale through it. So I know we talk a lot about it. I know everybody thinks about scale and the agility side of it. But I think when you see those and you see those real actions take place, it really sets home. And I would just encourage you, we talked about the well-architected reviews. That is the same process that if you went to AWS and you said, hey, I'm stuck, I'm on this journey, I'm only 5 to 10% of where I want to be. Would you be willing to come in here and, and help us do a review? We are a certified partner to do that as well. We had to get certified. We do the same process that AWS would do. I would encourage you to do those. We do those on a fair amount of basis, and they really ramp up. Like, get a level set of where you're at. We can help the process. I mean, sometimes it is that, playing off the exercise metaphor, sometimes it's just getting up and finally getting to the gym the first time. Like, that's the starting point. Everybody can get there. And these well-architected reviews are a great way to kind of see where you're at and see if you're planning it out right and you're building it in the correct way. So I would encourage you to take advantage of those. We'll work with you as a partner. There's really no cost to them. And you then can sit there and say, all right, is that agility going to be there? Am I cloud first, but my spend isn't representing that? Or am I cloud first and I have that agility to be like a task as when something comes along, or my product team comes in and wants to do something faster, that I can respond, right? So I just encourage you to use that. I think it's a tool that when folks come out of it, they're always going, thank gosh we did that, versus just someone kind of sitting there wondering where they're at and what their position is.
Thank you for that, Jamie. Pause for 1 second, see if there's anything else, because I think that segues really nicely to the next question that I have really for the whole team here is, as you're going through this migration process, what are some early indicators that perhaps there's an issue that folks can be looking for before it becomes a major challenge or a major problem? Jamie, I'm going to really quickly kind of remind you of a story you were just telling me the other day that I think ties nicely into this. The cloud team at a large financial institution wasn't talking to the infrastructure team, and they were both kind of at odds with each other. I think that's probably an early indicator. I don't know if you wanted to touch on that any.
Yeah, I think that's common, right? That's we see that, in especially mid to larger enterprises, that if you've brought a cloud team in, you've brought some engineering folks. Cecilia was kind of hitting on this. You start to ramp new people. They're getting up to speed. They're diving in. They're all trying to learn it very fast. And while they're doing that, they start to look at, okay, let's get ourselves set up for the right process here and the right journey. And they kind of stay in their own world. And then you have the infrastructure team that's running and supporting petabytes of data and a huge network. And they're not necessarily, they kind of look at each other as sometimes competition, right? Like this, and unfortunately, it just, I don't know how else way to say it, but it kind of becomes a standoff. And so you've got the CIO above it saying, like, let's figure this out. Let's figure this process out. And, one of the things that I think we have seen happen a lot is we call it our digital acceleration program, where clients will say, hey, look, we'd like to just move this app to the cloud. And we kind of pause them a bit and say, let's step back and make sure that we're really understanding where you're trying to go. Because we all know, if you understand any of this, it's people, it's process. It's not just the technology. So gathering in this digital acceleration, which you have to have buy-in at the top level. Ideally the CEO, but if you can go to the CIO, that's if CIO pulls this in. We have that digital acceleration. We interview the stakeholders on both sides, because that is key to making sure that everybody's on the same page and talking the same language, and that one's not taking the other job, because several of the panelists mentioned you can put them in different roles. There's a lot of stuff to do. Like your challenges don't necessarily go away. They just manifest differently, right? You're moving your data center to the cloud. You're still going to have issues. Now, you may take off some of those issues by going into AMS and saying, I don't want to manage that underlying infrastructure, so to speak, in the cloud. And that then frees up people to do, more transformative things. But, I think you can get really stalled if you don't have somebody at the top of the organization that's driving these, two organizations to come together to put a plan together. The digital accelerations kind of manifested themselves out of clients saying, hey, we're getting stuck. They're now becoming repeatable processes. We just actually signed one up here in Silicon Valley last week, and their whole process is, let's map out a plan, right? Let's think about 1, 2, 3 years out and figure out how we get there. But more importantly, let's pull in all the constituents that have a play in this and make sure that they're all on that same page of that journey. Otherwise, you're going to get 15% in, and we're going to see the common stall that we've been talking about.
Thank you for that, Jimmy. Yeah, I think that's a great example.
So I would
Go
say,
ahead, Cecilia.
building on what Jamie said, within the organization, this is a great time to walk the floor, right? When they say we have a plan or we've done it, we've migrated to the cloud, you go, great, show me. And have the technical people demo it. Ask, where are the ops, where's the NOC? Where's the ops people? What are they looking at? Bring in the finance people and say, do you know how much this cost us? Show me. And I think it's really important, especially in the first, couple of apps or in the first phase, when you think there is success or you think there is a plan, doing kind of that tabletop exercise of, okay, great, show me. And you should see by the, who comes to the table, who brings information, and whether or not that it is actually working, or whether the teams are not really talking to each other, right? Because in a conference room, they're going to bring you a beautiful deck. Great deck, everything will be on paper, but I think for the first pass, you need to get out of your chair and actually say, okay, show me, and ask from all aspects that you can think of: security, financial, operational, and you'll see, is the team actually working together, and is it real, or is it still just a paper study?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Chris, you asked for the indicators, early indicators. I'd say number one is if you don't have any indicators. So leaders that haven't identified metrics that actually measure up to success, and they're not publishing them and making them very public for the organization to see. That transparency is key, because it'll breed a culture of trust and transparency throughout the rest of the organization. And then, I think then the other one is anybody who, any engineer that puts the brakes on things and says, we can't do it and here's why. For every one of those, I've got 5 anecdotes that can squash as to why that is. And so organizations that can get out of hyperbole, that can, work based on metrics, that can carve their workloads down into smaller digestible chunks, and then to Cecilia's point, prove it, show me, I think are the ones that are going to be able to cross that chasm. The ones that don't, it's pretty obvious where the cultural issues exist and why they erode the ability for success.
It's a great point, Dustin. And we are about at time here, guys. I cannot thank the team here enough for joining us and sticking around for this full conversation. I thought this roundtable piece was really insightful, and I feel like even I've learned a lot through this conversation. So thank you so much for doing that. what we tried to do today really was show how InterVision can support you at every phase of your cloud adoption journey, whether that's you're in the pre-migration phase, you're doing your planning, your business case building, your total cost of ownership, or you're in the migration and maybe things aren't moving as fast as you'd like and you need support getting those applications into the cloud, or maybe your applications are in the cloud and they're not operating as smoothly as you'd like. We've built a portfolio of solutions backed by our AWS accreditations to really support you in every phase of that cloud adoption journey. So whether you just want to start a conversation or just get the ball rolling, we really encourage you to reach out to us. It doesn't have to be massive migration workloads that we're talking about here. It could be something like the well-architected review or an immersion day, or maybe just a dialogue with one of our experts here. And again, I'll highlight that Dustin, one of our key SMEs here at InterVision, he's the guy you're going to talk to, right? So that was one of the reasons why I thought it was so important to feature him today. And you can have that dialogue with him about where you are at a business level and where you're trying to go and really start charting that out and what that needs to look like. So please visit intervision.com/contact or just hit that orange contact button when you get onto our website and fill out the form with a little bit of details, and we'll reach out to you right away to start that dialogue. So I hope we built the case for you to understand how we can support you at every phase of your journey. And if you want to reach out to us, that's the best way to do so, unless you're currently working with an InterVision rep. Of course, in that case, please reach out to your InterVision rep, and they can definitely very quickly connect you with the right folks to start that dialogue. So again, thank you everyone for joining.